I was talking to one of my sisters earlier today, and I told her I was coming to do this presentation, and she said, "Knock 'em dead," which I thought was appropriate, not only for the subject matter, but you've been here, many of you, all day long listening to lawyers. You're pretty much ready to be knocked dead, aren't you? I don't know exactly what's been covered so far today, so if I'm repeating things you've already heard, I'm sorry about it. If you start to fall asleep, I'll get the hint and just move along. So let's get right to the nub of it. Who's going to pull your plug and when? And why? Or why not? Just by the way, does anybody here think they're not going to die? Put your hand up if you... Okay, I'd just like to make sure I've got the right audience. And just by the way, on occasion when I ask that question, a few hands do actually go up. Boy, are they in for a rude surprise at some point in time. This is a friend of mine, and I have his permission to use this picture. He gave me authority before he died. My friend Larry went toe-to-toe with cancer 4 times and won the first 3 bouts. And if you're wondering, yes, that is a martini glass in his hand, and yes, that is a vodka martini in the glass. So here's Larry in palliative care a few days before he passed on, and his wife brought him a martini, and one of the nurses said, "You can't give him a martini." Well, why not? Well, it's bad for him. Well, what will it do to him? Oh, okay, maybe he can have the martini. It was important to Larry that he had that martini, and it was his last one. And I was there to, well, they wouldn't let me drink a martini in palliative care, but I guess it was okay for him. But one of the things I said to Larry, and he was in remarkably good spirits considering he was on his way out, but he told me he'd had a very good life and he had no regrets, and that he did not wish his dying process to be prolonged. He recognized what was going on. And he looked at me and he said, "And by the way, I've donated my body to the medical school." And I said, "Well, out of curiosity, Larry, why did you do that?" And he said, "Well, I won't be needing it anymore." And I tell that story just to remind all of us that organ donation is important, and it is something you need to think about as part of your legacy, if you will, and it may be the most important part of your legacy. So let's talk about death. When are you dead? When are you dead? What's the legal definition of dead? Guess what? There isn't one. You're dead when the doctor says you're dead. And just by the way, if your organs are going to be donated for transplant purposes, you may live a few days longer as everything gets organized in order to arrange that. And in that situation, what they will do is apply the death test by way of brain dead as opposed to cardiac death. Because if your brain stops, the rest of you can keep going, meaning the organs don't begin to deteriorate, but once your heart stops, those organs begin to deteriorate, and they're not a lot of good anymore. So there is no legal definition of death. Medical definition originally was cardiac stoppages. And that was, of course, before we could look inside the skull and see whether there was any brain activity or not. And so now we have this, if you will, dual approach to when you're dead. There's also, and the law doesn't recognize this, but I think it's important that we recognize something called a dying process. In other words, the point at which you're no longer aware of your environment and you have an illness that is not reversible and death is imminent, whatever that means in the context of a life. So with all of that background, you need to ask yourselves, how long do you want to linger and what are you going to do about it? The answer is we don't know, because we're all too healthy to be able to predict what's going to happen to us, unlike my friend Larry, who knew that his end was imminent. How do you say at this point in our lives, here's when I want you to pull my plug? How do you do that? And as you're talking about that, what about the advances in medicine and science that are going to take place between now and when your time comes? How do you factor those in when you don't even know what they are? And what about, do you believe in miracles? Like, will God save you? Well, and if you don't believe in miracles, do the people who are going to make your decisions for you, if you can't, do they believe in miracles? God will save my father. And what about the cost of that continuing care? Now, in Canada, we're quite fortunate that we don't pay for hospitalization, but you need to think about the other costs. And right now, I'm only talking about the financial costs to your family. Do you know how expensive it is to park in a hospital? Now, if I have to go to Mount Sinai this afternoon, I'm leaving my car here and taking a taxi. It's a whole bunch cheaper than doing that. But all the time involved and all the expense, and, frankly, when I'm on my deathbed, I really don't care what it costs my family because it's not going to have any impact on me. But I'm one of the more selfish people, I'm guessing, in this room, and others of you may care about that. So there's one aspect. But the other aspect is, what about the emotional cost of that? And I'm going to give you a few examples of exactly that in a minute. Okay? So who have you told? Let's talk about the conversations you need to have. Who have you told about your own end-of-life wishes, values, beliefs, perspectives? How many of you want to die at home instead of in a hospital? How many want to die at home instead of in a hospital? Okay? Well, you're wrong. 90% of you are going to die in a hospital. Okay? Just by the way, in Taiwan, the probability of dying at home is closer to 85%. Over 90% of Canadians die in hospital, which, by the way, is no surprise to me. I mean, the food is terrible. It's full of sick people and germs. It's noisy. It's not a lot of fun. I don't know why you'd want to be there if you didn't have to be. But in Taiwan, where the philosophy of a good death is hugely important, what happens with a lot of people who are literally at death's door is, and there are private services to do this, they hire an ambulance with life support systems in place in the ambulance. They get taken home with life support, and they die by appointment. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Grandpa is going to pass away. If you'd like to come and pay your last respects, you should be here by 9:30. A light lunch will be served. In the Orient, in the Orient, they eat, and it just escapes me for the moment, but that particular kind of fish where if you get the wrong part of it, it kills you. Maybe that's why they're taking Grandpa home. Here, eat this. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but, I'm glad that you're finding a bit of humor in what I'm talking about. We're talking about death and dying, and, we're all going to do it. It's not like the weather. Everybody talks about it and nobody does it. It's death and dying. Nobody talks about it and everybody does it. And if we can't sort of make light about our own ends, then we're taking this all far too seriously, as serious a topic as this is. So just by the way, also, what have you been told? Do you know what you're facing? One of the end-of-life cases I was involved in was a man at end-stage dementia. He'd been in an intensive care unit for over a year when the treatment team finally decided they had to do something about this and applied to the Consent and Capacity Board to direct his wife to consent to withdrawal of life support. Well, she said to me, look at him. He's resting comfortably. His hair is combed. His mustache is trimmed. They shave him every day. She was able to avoid looking under the bed at all of the tubes and pipes going in and coming out of his body, able to avoid looking at the machines around him, monitoring what life signs he was still able to display. And she didn't see what was going on, and she sure wasn't there at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning when they had to change his dressings, which was painful because of bed sores. By the way, bed sore in his case meant an open wound from about the middle of his back to the bottom of his buttocks, lying in bed for a year, barely moving. Now, how many of you think that's a good way to go? Don't answer. Okay, so, what can possibly go wrong at the end of life, aside from medical error that we're not talking about today? So here are some of the things I've heard from people. He's a fighter. Yeah, well, every game ends, doesn't it? When God wants him, God will take him. How do you know you're not in the way of God? How do you know God's even paying attention? He never wanted to go to a nursing home. Put your hand up if you do want to go to a nursing home. Nobody wants to go, but sometimes that's the best option. And when you say something to your family like, don't ever send me to a nursing home, you'd better keep talking, because they may take you at face value and never send you to a nursing home. I know that's what he'd want. This was a very sad case. This man had done a power of attorney for personal care, and in it he had a, if you will, no heroic measures provision. Well, he didn't talk to his daughter about that. And it was her job to consent to discontinuing life support, her job to consent to pulling the plug. And they'd never had a conversation about it. And she said, that might be what he wants, but I'm not killing him. He didn't tell me that. His religious beliefs require that he suffer. I don't belong to that religion. There's nothing we can do for your mother. Yes, there is. You can keep her comfortable, you can treat her with dignity and respect, and you can allow her dying process to continue unimpeded. I know that's what it says, but that isn't what it means. Another situation, didn't talk to the family. And just by the way, lawyers are terrible, for the most part, at doing powers of attorney for personal care. You go see your lawyer for a power of attorney for personal care, a power of attorney for property, and a will. We're going to talk about the money all the time. Where do you, tax planning, estate work, okay? Deferring death taxes, avoiding probate costs. Oh, just by the way, I also did a power of attorney for you for personal care. Here, sign this. Oh, yeah. Okay. And so I've seen those where people will say, mother could not have agreed to that. It's against her religious beliefs. Well, maybe it was against your view of her religious beliefs. So let's call the lawyer who did it and see what conversation actually took place between lawyer and client around that. And the lawyer's answer was, well, I showed it to her before I got her to sign it. Okay, now, for a woman whose English is her third language, and this is a document in English, I wonder whether the import of those words was clear to her or not. So there's a conversation you need to have with your lawyer as well. Okay, he didn't read it. Lawyers are famous for shoving stuff under your nose, telling you sign here, I'm your lawyer, trust me. I will give you a tip. If ever a lawyer says to you in any context, I'm your lawyer, trust me, read everything. So you may have specific views. Hello.
Hello. Go ahead. She's resting.
No, but I'm pointing at you. Oh. Okay. What does this mean?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So if you have specific views about the end of your life, then you need to talk to the people around you who may be having to make those decisions. And some people think, well, I don't want to upset any of my children. I can't leave Freddie out of being my attorney for personal care. Well, the kids can't agree on who gets the cottage for the weekend, and you want them to agree on when to discontinue life support for you? Some years ago, I was interviewing two of my nephews with a view to appointing them my attorneys for personal care. I mean interviewing in a literal sense, because I wanted to make sure that whatever their personal beliefs were, they were able to advance mine. And one of the things I said to them was, there's this concept of the dying process when I'm never going to be aware of anything again but pain. And just by the way, so you know, pain is the last thing you will lose the ability to experience. You'll have no awareness of anything going on around you, but you'll hurt. And the doctors won't know how much pain medication to give you because you can't tell them. And the family's going to say, don't give him so much, you're drugging him. Okay? In any event, I'm having that conversation with my nephews, and I said, when I've entered my dying process, just replace the saline solution with a good 18-year-old single malt scotch, leave the room and turn out the lights. And one of my nephews looked at the other and said, well, give him the cheap stuff, he won't know the difference. So guess who is not my attorney for personal care? I'm glad I had that conversation. It's amazing what you can learn, okay? This is Hassan Rizzoli. I do not have direct consent to use this picture. However, since I took it off of Facebook, I don't really think there's a privacy issue with this. Mr. Rizzoli went to Sunnybrook in October of 2010 for routine brain surgery. Now, if you're going to shave my head, slice my scalp open, and scrape a tumor off of my brain, I don't care what you say. I don't count that to be routine anything. And so, in fact, I asked a friend of mine, a neurosurgeon, about this, and he looked at me and he said, well, it's not rocket science. But in any event, Mr. Rizzoli went to Sunnybrook to have a tumor removed from his brain, and the surgery was successful, but then he acquired an infection, meningitis, leaving him with an extremely limited brain function. He was originally diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state, but then he was upgraded, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because I don't see being minimally conscious and stuck in an intensive care bed as being an upgrade. But in any event, that's what happened to Mr. Rizzoli. And he's still there in intensive care in Sunnybrook. Okay, what's missing from that story? There's no evidence that Mr. Rizzoli had a power of attorney for personal care or that anybody suggested it to him. There's no evidence that he had discussions with his family about what if, nor discussions with his surgeon about what if. And so I said to my friend, the brain surgeon, don't you talk to people about what might go wrong and what they want done in that case? And he said, are you out of your head? Which I think is a wonderful thing for a brain surgeon to say. But he said to me, are you out of your head? I don't want to scare the daylights out of somebody the day before I slice his skull open. I want him thinking positively. Well, if you're ever going to slice my skull open, I guarantee I'm not thinking positively no matter what. But you know, when you go to hospital, if you're morbidly obese, I guarantee they'll send you a dietitian. If you're a smoker, I guarantee you'll get a visit from the nicotine replacement therapist. If you've got a really crappy home situation, they're not sending you home until you've talked to the discharge planner. Apparently in hospitals, it doesn't occur to them that you might die one day, if not from brain surgery, then certainly from something else. They don't talk to you about this. They don't talk to you about this unless you raise the issue. So there's Mr. Rizzoli in that situation. Well, fortunately for Mr. Rizzoli, or unfortunately rather, his lawyers can't do his power of attorney now. He's certainly well beyond any level of capacity. The doctors can't cure him, and it's too late to ask him what he wants. Fortunately, his family knows that he would want to be kept alive in this circumstance. Unfortunately, his doctors disagree. Just by the way, Mr. Rizzoli's case is the only end-of-life case in Canada in this context, in the context of medical futility, the doctor's phrase, in the context of medical futility that has ever gotten to the Supreme Court of Canada. In my book, it would be a curse to say to somebody, may your family and doctors be in court over your future while you're in an intensive care bed. I don't think that's really in anybody's best interests, certainly not the patient's. Here's another story I would like to share with you. This lady was an elderly widow with kidney failure and all kinds of complications. She was very sick. She had no power of attorney for personal care. She had 2 children. She had a son who wanted her life to be continued and a daughter who thought she should be allowed to die. Well, when we delved at a consent and capacity board hearing a little further into their view about things, we discovered that really what the son wanted was just to get paroled so he could come home and pay last respects to his mother and try and make peace for all of the horrible things that he had done. And daughter didn't really care whether mother lived or died if she could only get some of the money out of the house. I'm sorry, am I touching anybody's particular family nerves here? I can't imagine that. I'm counsel at the law firm Whaley Estate Litigation. Most of the battles they have involve people who are already dead, but not always. And a lot of the work that I do involves end-of-life litigation, and I will tell you that every one of Kim's cases, and all of the other lawyers in the firm, and every one of my cases is a heartbreak. There are no happy endings once you've got lawyers involved in your dying process. So anyway, what happened to Mrs. IA after all of this? Well, what happened was her substitute decision makers can't agree. Her lawyers can't do a power of attorney for her at this point in time. Her doctors can't figure out what she wanted, and they didn't think they could cure her either. So what actually happened in the end of this? Well, guess what happened? Her kids fought it out at a consent and capacity board hearing. I happened to be the presiding member at that hearing, and I declined to appoint either of them because I didn't think either of them would act in her best interests, not theirs. Because when you're a substitute decision maker, and you need to understand this, and they won't tell you in the hospital, they won't tell you what your obligations are. They'll say, here's what we recommend, okay? But when you're a substitute decision maker, the law tells you how you should make that decision. There are guiding principles, and in this situation, I didn't think either of those children would follow those guiding principles. So she had no other relatives, and consequently the decision defaulted to public guardian and trustee. And what happens is when you have the highest substitute decision makers ranking, in this case both son and daughter, and they disagree, then automatically the decision goes to public guardian and trustee unless another member of the family goes through the process of seeking to be appointed to make the decision, another member of the family or a family friend. So public guardian and trustee is a branch of the Attorney General's office in the province of Ontario. How many of you want the government to be making your end-of-life decisions for you? Okay, I drove up Keele Street. They haven't got that fixed yet, and it's been like that for 2 years. Those are the people who may be making your decisions for you. Have I scared you yet? So, however, Mrs. IA got better. And the lawyer who represented her at the Consent and Capacity Board hearing went to visit her just as she was about to be discharged from hospital and brought her the judgment that I had written outlining what her kids had been fighting over and what they wanted to do and the evidence that came out. And so guess what she did? She did powers of attorney and a new will. Apparently her recovery was pretty close to a miracle, and I don't count on them for my planning. So, who decides whether or not you can decide for yourself? And this is an important thing because at some point you may lose the ability to make your own healthcare decisions. So what happens is this. It's every health practitioner's obligation to obtain informed consent to treatment. Informed consent, of course, can only come from a capable person. So if the doctor thinks you're not capable of making that decision, then he will seek informed consent from somebody else. Are there any doctors here? Okay, well, that's too bad because I would have loved to have put one on the spot. There is a legal definition of capacity to make your own healthcare decisions. Around the world, in most civilized jurisdiction, there is a legal definition of capacity. Around the world, about 80% of doctors do not know that legal definition. In fact, most doctors think you're capable if you agree with them and incapable if you disagree with them. And that's not the test. So in any event, you may have a substitute decision maker. Capacity comes in different flavors, and there are different tests of capacity for each of these. Capacity to make your treatment decisions, capacity to make a decision about admission to a care facility, a nursing home, capacity to do a power of attorney for personal care, capacity to do a power of attorney for property, to manage your own personal care, a higher standard than capacity to do a power of attorney. You may not be able to take care of yourself, but you know who to trust to do it. And also to manage your own property. You know, think of Bill Gates with all of those billions and billions of dollars. If he lives long enough, he will probably suffer from dementia and lose the ability to manage his own property. But in the early stages of dementia, he may have lost the ability to manage his property, but he might still know who he trusts to manage his property for him. So it's an easier test for capacity to grant a power of attorney than it is to manage property or to manage personal care. Okay? However, your lawyer can't predict your illness or their course. Your lawyer can't determine when you might lose your capacity to make your own decisions or predict what your substitute decision makers will do for you. Your doctor can't necessarily cure you. Your doctor can't determine when you might lose capacity to make your own decisions or predict what your substitute decision makers are going to do. How many of you have car insurance? How many of you want a car accident? How many of you expect you're going to die, and what kind of insurance do you have around that? Not to keep you alive, rather to make sure you get the quality of death and the dignity at the end of your life that you hope for. And what are you doing about it? An answer is the documents are not enough. You've got to have the conversations with the people who will be making those decisions. Firstly, to satisfy yourself that they'll make the decisions you want, but secondly, to satisfy yourself, in my view at least, that you won't destroy them when the day comes that they have to make those horrible decisions. I know people who just should not be asked these hard questions on behalf of people they love. Just by the way, I also know people who have fought for the life of a loved one but would not want the same thing done for or to them. In fact, the vast majority of people who think they're saving Grandpa's life don't want to be tortured at the end of their own life, which is basically what they're doing to Grandpa. And just by the way, an intensive care unit in a hospital, what happens to those patients if there was no consent, that would be torture within the meaning of the Geneva Convention. They do horrible things to us in intensive care. They hope that they're doing it for a good reason. And a lot of health practitioners end up enduring what the professions now call moral distress. Why are we torturing this man for no benefit when all he can experience is pain? And some of the times the answer is nothing other than, well, we're doing it because the family insists. Also, don't forget that your lawyer probably won't ask the probing questions that help you pick the right attorney for personal care. Most lawyers don't go into that kind of detail. They won't make you promise to talk to your substitute decision makers to ensure they understand your wishes, values, and beliefs, and will fight for that, not for what their perspective of your best interests are. And most lawyers don't know about the Consent and Capacity Board and the role that it can play in resolving some of these hugely unfortunate disputes. And as for your doctor, well, he's not likely to be asking those probing questions to help you pick the right attorney either. How many of you have been to your doctor in the past year? Okay. And how many of you, when you've been with your doctor, have had him or her say to you, just by the way, what about your end-of-life wishes? You know, they don't do it. You know why? They don't have time to do it, or at least they don't think they have time to do it. And even when you're sick, And in the case of the man that I talked about who'd been in intensive care for 12 months, I mean, this was not a surprise. He didn't have a car accident. He didn't have a stroke. He had dementia, which is a creeping disease. And he had dementia for 4 or 5 years before he was admitted finally to hospital. And he had health care during that whole period of time. It astonishes me that nobody at any point said to him, look, you've got Alzheimer's. We know what this looks like at the end of life. How long do you want to keep going? And all we have is his wife's interpretation of his wishes, of his values and beliefs, which in his case came down very simply to he's Catholic, he would have to suffer. Your doctor also won't make you promise to talk to your substitute decision makers. And your doctor probably won't initiate the consent and capacity board process. Doctors hate lawyers. Not that I blamed them, but that's a separate issue. So there's this magnificent process unique to Ontario. It's recognized around the world as one of the best methods for resolving those completely intractable end-of-life disputes, and the vast majority of doctors won't initiate that process. So how do you choose the wrong decision maker? The answer is, usually is how you do it. Most people have chosen the wrong decision maker because they haven't had conversations with the people they've chosen. They just figure their kids are smart and will do the right thing. Or some people say that they're going to, well, my wife will make my decisions. Yeah, but she's older than I am and she's already demented. Now, that's not true. In my case, she's neither older, well, she might be demented, but she's not older than I am. Are you watching, dear? Hi. My life may end overnight. Well, what about your children? Okay, well, we know all about children. They can't agree on the time of day, and you want them to make this decision for you. What about your brother living in an ashram and having taken a vow of silence? I'm not smart enough to make these things up, okay? These happen, okay? Or your sister who doesn't believe in modern medicine. Okay, he's got cancer. Oh, give him some herbal tea. Okay, well, if my belief is that when I'm diagnosed with cancer, I should have herbal tea, then that's the right decision, except in my family, we know that I don't believe in herbal remedies. I believe in scotch. How do you choose the right decision maker? Well, obviously, someone who genuinely cares about your well-being, who will be capable, who will be available, and who will be willing to make these decisions. And just by the way, in my family, nobody goes to a hospital alone. We don't trust the healthcare system, okay? I don't make my best decisions when I'm in pain. And I miss things when I'm in pain. And so if I need to go to hospital, somebody's coming with me. And you need an advocate. I should tell you that a year and a half or so ago, my eldest sister suffered a cardiac arrest and was in intensive care at a very good hospital. And we had the family meeting. And a few days later, I had occasion to review the chart notes that were made during that family meeting. And, the doctors, while they write in hieroglyphics using a mirror in reverse, you can't understand a word that they say. But the social workers have this lovely floral handwriting that at least is legible. So I'm reading the social worker note, and she's identifying who's there: Dr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, children of the patient, da-da-da-da-da, sisters of the patient, da-da-da-da, brother of the patient, bracket, litigates end-of-life cases. So obviously, the person you choose needs to know your wishes, values, and beliefs. Now, how are they going to know your wishes and values and beliefs? Are they going to read them in tea leaves? Well, if you don't tell them, they're going to read them in tea leaves. You also need someone who's prepared to educate themselves about your conditions and your prognosis. Okay, an ability to understand what's going on. And doctors aren't going to talk to them in plain English. You know, don't count on that. You know, Mark, as a result of a CVA, your sister suffered and we'd like to palliate her, okay? Okay, doctor, but do everything you can for her. She needs to go to a wedding next Tuesday. Okay? You need an advocate. You know, we're talking about a very serious subject here, and I'm making light of it. I'm not really making light of it. I am making light generally. That happens to be my style of talking, and what we're covering here is hugely important for each of you to have these conversations with the people that you love, not only for your own sake when your day comes, but for their sake should their day come before yours. And misfortunes do happen, and sometimes younger people surprise us by ending up in hospital in life-threatening situations unexpectedly. And so we need to know their values and beliefs as well. And just interestingly, my sister, of whom I spoke a moment ago, ended up passing away as a result of what happened. Well, her son, my nephew, a few weeks ago, quite literally fell off a cliff in Costa Rica while he was hiking and seriously injured himself. And one of the first emails I got from him was, "If things go wrong, don't do to me what we did to Mother last year." Now, it happens that my sister's values and beliefs mandated that we do all things to attempt to continue her life. That was her perspective. His perspective is very much different than that. And he advocated for her. He fought tooth and nail to keep her alive until we knew that she had no prospect of any recovery. His view's a little different than that. And one of my other sisters, by the way, agrees with him, just by the way, as do I. And that sister, while my eldest sister was in intensive care, about to undergo surgery for the 4th time, said to me, "Don't let them do that to me." I said to her, "Don't worry, Terry, if it was you in there, you'd already be in the ground." And she said, "Thank you." An important conversation that we had, isn't it? Okay, so if you have a POA for personal care, are you done? No, not until you've had detailed discussions with your attorney so that they know your wishes, values, and beliefs, and you've empowered them to make those difficult decisions as you wish to have them made when the day comes. So how do you start this conversation? Because it's not an easy one, okay? And just by the way, and I don't remember if this slide is in here or not, but I'm going to tell you this story. When my mother was in her mid-80s, I decided she and I had better have this conversation. And so it went like this. First of all, Mother, you know, the day could come you can no longer make your own healthcare decisions. Who do you want to do it if you can't? And she said, "You," pointing at me. And I said, "Well, Mother, I'm quite honored about that, but what about my 3 sisters? And she said, "Oh yeah, sure. Barbara will never pull the plug. Joyce will pull the plug. Sorry, Terry will pull the plug the first time I forget where I put my glasses. And Joyce will spend the rest of my life trying to get the 2 of them to agree," which established in my mind that she was capable to do a power of attorney because she understood the family that well. And so I said to her, "Well, but why are you choosing me?" And she said, "Well, I know you'll make the right decision." And I said, "But Mother, how will I know what the right decision is?" And she said, "You'll ask your sisters." Mother had the good fortune, if not good sense, to die at the age of 94 at home in her own bed one night. She just didn't wake up. Sign me up for that program, please. So, however, I had to continue the conversation because I wanted to know what wishes and values and beliefs she had to apply to her end-of-life decisions. And so I said to her, so mother, what happens if you're lying in a hospital bed and you're sort of no longer aware of what's going on and the doctors are saying it's time to let you go? And she looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, when there's nobody home, you turn out the lights. And that was everything I needed to know about her values and beliefs and her wishes. And it wasn't that detailed conversation about, well, after 17 months of dementia, it will be time, or if I can't open my eyes, or if I forget who you were. That's all too detailed for this abstract conversation. But I knew what she meant by that turn of phrase. Okay. My nephews know what I mean when I say replace the saline solution with single malt. My mother trusted me to respect her wishes. I only trusted one of my nephews. But I had another conversation, by the way, a few years later with my mother when she turned 90 and was diagnosed with cancer. And at the age of 90, her short-term memory was a little bit weak. And so while the doctor was explaining to her and to me the risks and benefits of chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, some of the above, all of the above, none of the above, I knew that my mother wasn't able to hold all of that information in her head to be able to compare the risks and benefits. She'd lost the ability to understand the information in any meaningful sense. But after our second visit to the cancer clinic, she said to me, so I've got cancer. Yeah, Mom, you do. Will it kill me? Yeah, Mom, this is serious. This can kill you. Will it kill me before or after I die of old age? Now, that's funny, but it's also hugely perceptive, isn't it? How aggressive treatment do you want at the age of 90? How do you balance quality of life versus quantity of life at that point in time? How do you balance that? And I guess my mother answered the question for me. I got one more story about my dear mother that I'm going to share with you. In her mid-80s, she fractured her hip, went to hospital, had hip reduction surgery, got a new hip joint, went to rehab, and actually got remarkably better, so that a few years later she was walking again. But after she was discharged from the rehab hospital, she was still in a wheelchair. And she did not want to go to a care facility. And so fortunately for her, she was able to afford, and her children were able to arrange 24/7 home care over her better judgment, because she thought she could manage on her own, which wasn't in the cards. But so on the appointed day of discharge, I went to the hospital and I picked her up, and in the car already was Margaret, the caregiver that we were moving into my mother's apartment with her. And we took Mother home, and the place had been cleaned and the dead plants pushed out and the fridge filled, and Margaret made us lunch, and it was a beautiful spring day. And after lunch, I thought we should go for a walk. So we're walking down the street, and Margaret's pushing Mother in the wheelchair. And all of a sudden, I see a friend of mine heading in our direction. And I panicked, because it hadn't occurred to me how to introduce Margaret to anybody, How do I respect my mother's dignity? What's the right way to do this? Caregiver, nurse, companion, what's the right turn of phrase? So it went like this. George, you've already met my mother, and this is Margaret, her lesbian lover. And my mother, at the age of 87, looked up at me from her wheelchair, and she said, at my age, I should change my spots? I didn't think she knew what a lesbian was. Anyway, back on track here, you need to have these conversations for the sake of everybody that you care, as well as for your own sake. Death is on the news all the time. It's a great time to segue into this conversation. Watching television drama. Do you know how many people get killed on television in an average night? You can always pick the right one. Visiting a friend in hospital, or going to a funeral, or before seeing a lawyer about wills and powers of attorney. Certainly before going to a hospital for just about anything, okay? And for that matter, before you go see your doctor, okay? You need to have these conversations to protect yourselves in the case of your own end of life, to protect yourself from people who mean well and do the wrong thing. In the case of somebody that you love, for your own sake, so that you're not spending the rest of your life wondering whether or not you did the right thing for somebody else. Okay, so here we are. I did include this slide. When there's nobody home, you turn out the lights. I've never heard it put better. Okay, here are some things you should never say unless you really, really, really mean them. Don't ever say, I never want to go to a nursing home. Nobody does. The day may come. Don't ever say, do everything. Do you know how long you can technically be kept alive? Don't let me die? What does that entail? Okay, thank you for your time. I hope that none of you sees Monday without having had that conversation, if you haven't already. Thank you. Mary, do I have time for questions or more bad jokes? Questions. Okay.
I've got a question for you, Mark. I've heard you talk before, and I think this audience and the people from home would be interested to know how you go about visiting clients in hospital and the process that you go around videotaping your discussions.
Sure.
Thank you.
On occasion, other lawyers retain me to go to hospitals or nursing homes or retirement facilities to do new wills or powers of attorney or both for clients whose capacity might be a little bit iffy. And they pick me because of the decade I spent on the consent and capacity board. So I think, know a little bit more about the topic than a lot of other lawyers do. But the reason that they retain me instead of going themselves is because these are cases in which there is quite possibly going to be litigation as a result of the end of life, if you will, change of documents. Okay. What do you mean, Grandma cut me out of her will the day before she died? She wasn't capable. Well, what I do in those circumstances is I video record my interviews with the client. And I go through all of the questions that I need to ask in order to satisfy myself that this person is capable. Most lawyers take notes when they do that, but handwriting doesn't quite convey what somebody actually saw or appreciated during the conversation that takes place. And so what happens occasionally anyway, and I do this, I do one or two wills and powers of attorney a month for somebody in hospital with limited or eroded capacity. And on occasion what happens is a few months later I get a phone call, Mark, you know that granddaughter you cut out of Mrs. Smith's will? Well, she's suing. And so what happens is at some point, a copy of my video recording of our interview goes to the granddaughter's lawyer so that they can see what transpired. And so far, over the past 8 years, every time one of those videos has gone to one of those lawyers, there has been no litigation because, and I just ask enough questions. And I'm not hugely patting myself on the back, but I don't understand why more lawyers don't video record some of those interviews. And just by the way, I also take a portable printer and my laptop with me when I go to hospitals. And that's not for any wisdom. That's just because I've discovered how bad traffic in downtown Toronto is, so I can do it all in one visit and you know, get the instructions, pack myself up, go down, have a coffee, prepare the documents, print them off right then and there, and go back upstairs. The problem with that approach is this. Hospitals don't let their staff be witnesses. Okay. You go to any hospital, they'll say, oh yeah, everybody should have a power of attorney for personal care. Good, can I have that nurse be a witness with me of this lady's power of attorney? No, we don't let people be witnesses. Oh, so I have to arrange my own witness. They won't let me have a witness. But of course, they're also not encouraging people to do powers of attorney. They're not handing out any information. I mean, they'll tell you how to lose weight. They'll tell you how to have a healthy heart. They won't tell you how to have a good death. Any more questions? Well, then, thank you for the privilege of your time. And I guess if there's no more questions, I have knocked you dead.